Famed author William Faulkner said of his home state, "To understand the world, you must first understand a place like Mississippi." As I take you on this journey through every part of the United States, it would be a mistake to ignore the story of the Magnolia State. The challenges it deals with, such as high poverty, low development and quality of life, and an economy that's struggled to diversify, have brought severe economic difficulties to a state with among the worst histories of racism in the United States. In pretty much any statistic generally related to quality of life in a state, Mississippi typically ranks at or near either the bottom or the top, whichever would be worse in that particular instance. Because of this, it's a state that's often looked down upon by outsiders. I don't want to fall into that trap. In this video, like all my videos in this series, I'll try to present a fair and non-judgmental view of the state, sharing the aspects of Mississippi that make it a unique and special place, while still not shying away from a frank discussion of the challenges it deals with and has dealt with throughout its history. After all, Mississippi has a lot to offer, from friendly people, great music, and delicious food, to beautiful beaches on the Gulf Coast, vast pine and oak forests, and the wide and muddy lower reaches of its namesake, one of the largest and most important rivers in the world. Mississippi is a unique and fascinating state, and the 21st place I will cover in the US Explained, a 56-part series on every state, territory, and federal district in the country by order of admission. Hello and welcome to That Is Interesting. I'm your host Carter. This is the US Explained, episode 21, Mississippi. As I've continued growing this channel, one of my main goals has been to professionalize the kind of content I'm making for you all. Instead of just talking about the places I cover, I'm going to start visiting some of them, filming on site, and interviewing locals and experts. I've got a filmmaking trip planned for this summer, and a lot of fascinating videos are going to come out of it. Now, if you've ever traveled internationally, you'll know that a VPN is essential. I personally use NordVPN. I actually used it well before they ever reached out to me for a sponsorship. NordVPN is affordable, high quality, and easy to use, and it comes in handy all the time. It works by routing your internet traffic through servers around the world and encrypting it, keeping you safe from hackers or anyone trying to steal your data or even spy on you. On top of its cybersecurity benefits, there are a whole bunch of other ways NordVPN can help you out. Did your favorite show get taken off its streaming platform? With NordVPN, you can connect to the internet from your choice of dozens of countries around the world, and watch it from somewhere else where it's still available, all without ever leaving your home. As I'm writing videos for this channel, it's important to me that I can avoid internet censorship when doing my research, which in some places really isn't possible without a VPN. If you value cybersecurity and internet safety, or just want to have access to a wider range of content, whether at home or abroad, then I highly recommend getting NordVPN. The best part is, you can go to nordvpn.com/thatisinteresting and get a 2-year plan plus 4 months for free. If you don't like the service, you have 30 days to return it and get your money back. According to the Köppen climate classification, Mississippi sits entirely in the humid subtropical climate zone, with hot summers, mild winters with very little snow, if any, and high humidity. It sits in a lush and rainy part of the country, getting on average 56.48 inches of precipitation every year, which makes it the second rainiest state in the US, surpassed only by its neighbor, Louisiana, and slightly surpassing another neighboring state, Alabama. This heavy rainfall helps support a heavily forested landscape. Nearly the entire state is covered in trees, save for 2 important agricultural regions, the Black Belt in the northeast and the Delta in the northwest. It's the 8th most forested state in the country, with 65% tree cover, and the lumber industry is a major aspect of the state's economy. The entire state is located in the Central Time Zone. It's nicknamed the Magnolia State after the southern magnolia, an iconic tree in the south that grows all over the state, with large white flowers. The flower is even the centerpiece of the state's flag, a really nice looking flag that in my opinion is one of the better state flags in the country. It's also the newest state flag in the country, although Utah recently voted to adopt a new flag, but it won't go into effect for another year. Many southern states incorporate elements of Confederate flag designs into their flags, some more subtly than others, but Mississippi was the only one to just blatantly use a Confederate battle flag as a major part of its state flag. It consisted of a Confederate flag in the upper left corner, on top of a blue, white, and red stripe taking up the rest. The flag was quite controversial, and also just not very well designed, and calls to change it had been made for well over a century, in which some version of it had been in use. During the nationwide Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, the state government voted to remove the flag and begin a process for selecting a new one, which was adopted in January of 2021. The new flag has a blue section in the middle, separated from two red sections by gold lines. In the middle sits a large magnolia surrounded by a ring of 20 white stars, as Mississippi was the 20th state, the words "In God We Trust," and a star composed of 5 gold diamonds for the state's 5 main indigenous tribes. In my opinion, it's a really well-designed flag that shows that a state flag redesign can come up with a much better looking and representative symbol for your state. There are a lot of states with indistinguishable state seal on blue background flags that should really use Mississippi's new flag as an example for how it's done. Mississippi is named, of course, after the Mississippi River, the main stem of the largest river system in the country, and the 4th longest river system on Earth, which forms much of the state's western border with Louisiana and Arkansas. The name of the river itself comes from the Ojibwe, native people who lived further upstream, around the river source in what is now Minnesota. They called it Mississippi, which translates to Great River, or the much cooler translation, Father of Waters. Mississippi takes up 46,923 square miles, or 121,530 square kilometers, making it pretty much in the middle in terms of land area, but a little on the smaller side out of the 50 states. It's a little larger than Pennsylvania and a little smaller than New York. Mississippi's home to 2.94 million residents, making it the 34th most populous state in the country, home to less people than Arkansas but more than Kansas. It's one of a number of states with less residents than Puerto Rico, a U.S. territory. The island's home to around 300,000 more people than Mississippi. The state's about in the middle but slightly on the lower side in terms of population density as well, with its 63.1 people per square mile, or 24.4 per square kilometer, placing it at 32nd out of the 50 states, slightly more densely populated than Arizona, and more sparsely populated than Vermont. For comparison, that's a similar population density to Brazil or Sudan. It also makes it the second least densely populated state east of the Mississippi River, surpassed only by Maine. It was one of only 3 states that lost population between the 2010 and 2020 censuses. Illinois also had a slight decline, and West Virginia had a more significant one. It was only a slight decline of 0.2%, but in the years after 2020, it's continued at a more rapid pace, and about a dozen or so other states, most notably New York and California, began to experience population decline as well. In Mississippi, the only areas that are growing at all are the suburbs of Memphis, Tennessee in the very north of the state, some of the eastern suburban counties of Jackson, and the Gulf Coast. But none of these regions are growing that fast, and Jackson itself, the state's capital and largest city, is declining in population, as are most of the rural areas in the state. In many rural areas in the state, but especially in the highly impoverished Delta, you can find counties that have lost between a quarter to a third of their entire population in the last decade alone. After decades of a difficult economic reality, made even worse during the pandemic, many Mississippians are trying their luck elsewhere, heading to other parts of the South that are on the rise like Tennessee, Texas, and Georgia. It's a trend that appears likely to continue, with the state's population projected to keep shrinking in the coming years. Mississippi is located in the southeastern part of the U.S., a region commonly referred to as the South. In particular, it's considered part of the Deep South, along with Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. These were the southern states with the highest rates of slavery, the most historically agriculture-dependent economies, and some of the worst histories of racism and segregation in the country. Today, they have some of the largest black populations in the country, and are often seen as the most culturally southern, the deepest part of the Deep South. The Mississippi Delta is sometimes called the most southern place on Earth. Vox even asked their readers which states they considered to be part of the South, and even though there were plenty of states people disagreed on including, nearly every single one of the more than 40,000 respondents, 98% agreed that Mississippi is part of the South, more than any other state. Mississippi borders 4 other states, as well as has a coast on the Gulf of Mexico. To its west and south sits Louisiana. To its west is Arkansas, Tennessee sits to its north, Alabama to its east, and the Gulf of Mexico to its south. Its border with Alabama begins east of the Gulf Coast city of Pascagoula and cuts north, leaning slightly northwest for 107 miles or 172 kilometers to a spot near the town of Matherville, where it begins to turn slightly more towards the northeast. There is barely any difference on the ground, but when this slight variation continues for hundreds of miles, it's pretty noticeable and gives each state a distinctive shape. It then continues northeast for 208 miles or 335 kilometers until it reaches a dammed section of the Tennessee River called Pickwick Lake, It then follows the course of the river northwest for just under 10 miles. It's a tiny border, you really wouldn't know it unless you're looking for it, but the state does control a tiny portion of the river. From there, it becomes an east-west border with Tennessee, turning west and running 119 miles or 192 kilometers all the way to the Mississippi River. Just before reaching the river, the border runs right against the city limits of Memphis, Tennessee. Downtown Memphis is just 10 miles to the north, and about 187,000 people live in suburban DeSoto County, in Mississippi cities that are suburbs of Memphis like South Haven and Olive Branch. Upon reaching the Mississippi River, it turns south, following the river and becoming a border with Arkansas, but the border itself diverges frequently from the river. This is because the river, especially in its flat southern stretches, has changed course frequently, sometimes naturally due to erosion and flooding, and in other instances due to people cutting off bends in the river to improve its navigability. These former bends then become oxbow lakes or streams. While the border retains its initial course, so much of Mississippi's border along the river frequently jumps to either shore. It continues to a spot around 150 miles or 242 kilometers to the south near the town of Glen Allen, where it becomes a border with Louisiana. It then continues to wind south, at times more southwest, for another 150 miles to near the town of Pinckneyville, where it leaves the river and makes a sharp turn east, becoming an east-west border with Louisiana lying to the south. It continues for 111 miles to the Pearl River, whose course it then follows south to its mouth in the Gulf. Mississippi is a fairly hilly state, but isn't home to any real mountains. Its tallest point, Woodall Mountain, is just 806 feet above sea level and sits in the northeast corner of the state, closest to the Appalachians, which are still pretty far away. Most of the state's rivers flow north to south, into the Gulf of Mexico. There's the Mississippi, of course, in the west, the Yazoo, which flows into it, forming the delta in between, the Pearl River, which flows into the Gulf from the center of the state, the Pascagoula in the southeast, and the Tombigbee in the northeast, which leaves the state into Alabama. Mississippi's, as well as neighboring Alabama's coasts on the Gulf, are fairly small, with only small sections of the states stretching down that far. The Gulf Islands, a string of small, sandy barrier islands, sit a few miles out from the mainland, then a number of bays, swamps, and bayous cut inland. Between the islands and the mainland sits a part of the Gulf called the Mississippi Sound. Nearly the entire length of Mississippi's Gulf Coast is urbanized. A long string of small cities and towns stretch from Bay St. Louis near the Louisiana border, along the coast to Pascagoula near the Alabama border. This urbanized strand of the Gulf Coast is centered around the cities of Biloxi and Gulfport, beach and casino towns that have been some of the more economically successful parts of the state. Interestingly, the two tallest buildings in the state, the Beau Rivage Casino Hotel and IP Casino Hotel, are both in Biloxi, not the larger Jackson, and 4 of the 5 tallest buildings in Mississippi are all casinos, a sign of that industry's relative success, but also the failures of other industries to fund major development in the state. The Gulfport-Biloxi area is together the second most populous urban area in the state, with around 236,000 people, and it's a big destination for beachgoers and vacationers from the deep south as well as other parts of the country. At the end of the day, it's still pretty small, around the same as the urban area populations of York, Pennsylvania, or Appleton, Wisconsin, testament to the predominantly rural nature of the state. Because Mississippi and Alabama have such small coastlines, the region's not far from a number of different states and cities. It's only a 2.5-hour drive from Slidell, Louisiana, through Mississippi and Alabama to Pensacola, Florida, taking you through 4 different states. That's less than the drive from Gulfport to Jackson, so the state's Gulf Coast sits not too far from New Orleans, Mobile, Alabama, and the Florida Panhandle. Despite its urbanization, it's also home to beautiful natural areas, many of its wetlands and islands set aside as wildlife preserves. As you go further north, most of the state is filled with low, tree-covered hills. The southern part of Mississippi is known as the Piney Woods. This forested region is home to many of the state's most beautiful forests and protected areas, like the DeSoto National Forest. In the southeast is Hattiesburg, home to the University of Southern Mississippi and around 80,000 people. And on the Mississippi across from Louisiana is Natchez, maybe one of the most beautiful places in the state. Natchez is pretty much your iconic Mississippi River town. It was a historic port for steamboats, and the Natchez Trace, an old roadway between it and Nashville built by Native Americans, later brought many settlers into the region. It's home to a beautiful downtown with historic buildings, paddle wheel boats, and a nice bridge across the river. Further to the north in the Piney Woods is one of the strangest attractions in the state, the Windsor Ruins. This was a massive mansion on a cotton plantation until someone dropped a cigarette in 1890 and the whole place burned down, except for the enormous Corinthian columns that flank the house. Today, all that's left are this eerie square of ornate columns sitting in the forests of rural Mississippi. Southern Mississippi is also home to Red Bluff, a striking red canyon formed by erosion of soft red clays by the Pearl River that's still eroding rapidly today, so much that they even had to move a nearby highway. In central Mississippi, Meridian, near the Alabama border, was an old railroad and industrial town that was once the largest city in the state. Today it's only home to 36,000 people, having since been in decline, but because of that has an old downtown with larger buildings than you'd imagine for a town of its size. In the west central part of the state, along the Pearl River, is Jackson. Probably the most well-known part of the state, it's Mississippi's capital and largest city, home to around 347,000 people in it and its suburbs. All in all, that's still pretty small as large as cities go. The 118th largest urban area in the country, it's home to less people than California cities like Victorville and Modesto, which you might not ever have heard of if you're not from California. West of Jackson, on the Mississippi River, sits Vicksburg, another historic Mississippi River town that played a key strategic role in the Civil War. It was also where the Mississippi mud pie, a famous Mississippi dessert, was invented. Further north, a string of rich, fertile soil creates a flat, arc-shaped prairie which cuts in through Alabama. Called the Black Belt after this rich soil, it's made up of the remnants of a prehistoric beach where skeletons of plankton made up chalk deposits that strengthen the soil. The term also came to refer to the large population of Black Americans that live in much of the rural South, descendants of enslaved people forced to work agricultural lands such as this. Some of the main cities in this agricultural belt are Starkville, home to the Mississippi State University, and Tupelo, the birthplace of Elvis, further north. Interestingly, Mississippi State is home to the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library. Grant wasn't from Mississippi, but the library was built there as a way to preserve history and try to reduce tensions between the North and the South. Much of north central and northeastern Mississippi outside of the Black Belt has a similar geography to the rest of the state. Low rolling hills covered in forests with intermittent farms nestled in between the woods. One of northern Mississippi's main cities is Oxford, home to the University of Mississippi, better known as Ole Miss, one of the state's largest and definitely its best known universities. Just east of the Mississippi River, along the Tennessee border, is Mississippi's third largest urban area, home to 187,000 people, the suburbs of Memphis. Like I mentioned earlier, Memphis is not far at all from the state border, and Mississippi towns in DeSoto County like Southaven, Olive Branch, and Horn Lake are part of the Tennessee city's suburbia that happens to be located in another state, and adds significantly to the mostly rural Mississippi's population. While most of the state is hilly and forested, a huge stretch of northwestern Mississippi is not. Lying between the Mississippi River to the west and the Yazoo River to the east, stretching all the way from the Memphis suburbs to Vicksburg, lies an enormous flat floodplain, crisscrossed by oxbows, rivers, and distributaries, and home to richly fertile soil as water from the Mississippi and Yazoo rivers have historically spilled and fanned out across the floodplain, depositing rich muds and sediments. It's called the Mississippi Delta. You've probably heard of the Delta before. All the issues and challenges Mississippi faces are significantly worse within the region. Though there's high poverty across the board throughout the entire state, in the Delta the numbers are staggering. At best, a third of Mississippians in some Delta counties are below the poverty line, at worst over half of some counties. Though it may seem to be a blessing, the Delta's fertile soil has been more often than not a curse. It drew wealthy white settlers who constructed massive cotton plantations and transformed the region into the country's center of cotton production. But the actual construction of these plantations, as well as the labor on the farms, the clearing of the forest that used to exist in the Delta, and the construction of floodwater control systems, was done by thousands of enslaved Black Americans forced to toil in the Delta's cotton farms, where they came to make up a huge majority of the population. After the end of slavery, there was little work in the Delta besides agriculture, and Black Mississippians had little money or possessions to their name, and often no ability to physically leave. An exploitative system of farm labor called sharecropping developed, in which Black farm workers made very little, if any, money, and often had no ability to leave. Though sharecropping is pretty much over today, residents of the Delta, the majority of whom are Black, descendants of these enslaved people and sharecroppers, often are part of families who have been kept from building up wealth through these exploitative labor systems. Today, though their situations have improved, there's little industry in the Delta besides agriculture. People whose families have been there, trapped in poverty for generations, face similar issues to their ancestors who worked as sharecroppers. They don't have enough money to make it elsewhere, and live in a region dominated by a single, very low-paying industry. The Delta is still almost entirely agricultural, and makes up one of the most impoverished regions in the entire United States, mostly in Mississippi, but stretching into neighboring Arkansas and Louisiana as well. All in all, it contributes significantly to Mississippi having the highest poverty rate of any state in the U.S. What is now Mississippi was originally home to a number of different indigenous peoples. The most prominent were the Choctaw, who lived in much of the state. Along the Gulf Coast lived the Pascagoula, Acolapissa, and Biloxi. The Yuchi, Chakchiuma, and Chickasaw lived in the north, and in the west, along the Mississippi River, there were a number of different peoples, including the Quapaw, Koroa, Tunica, Yazoo, Ofo, Tana, Natchez, and Homa. These were the native people who lived in the region when European settlers arrived. But thousands of years prior, ancient native peoples, sometimes referred to as the Mississippian culture, built massive earthen pyramids in cities across the Mississippi Valley and controlled a trade network that stretched across much of the continent. As European colonists arrived in North America, they brought with them diseases such as smallpox, which the native people of the continent had not been exposed to, and as such had little immunity. Disease decimated the continent's indigenous population, killing 90% of them, and those that survived often died at the hands of colonists as Europeans expanded their settlement westward. The first European explorers to reach the region were the Spanish. Hernando de Soto traveled through but didn't set up any settlements. European colonization wouldn't start for another century and a half when the French arrived. French colonists began settling the region in 1699, constructing a number of fortified towns. Fort Maurepas is located just across Biloxi Bay from Biloxi and Ocean Springs. Settlement would later move to Biloxi across the bay, and Fort Rosalie would later become Natchez, the oldest city on the banks of the Mississippi River. They were both part of New France, the name for the empire's North American possessions, and were specifically part of the colony of Louisiana, a sparsely populated trading colony with a few settlements spread through the Mississippi Valley. For nearly 70 years, France controlled the region and began bringing in enslaved people from Africa to work on agricultural plantations, beginning a system of slavery in Mississippi that would continue there for the next century and a half. In 1754, war broke out between France, which controlled much of the continent's interior, and Britain, which controlled much of its Atlantic coast. They clashed over a land hundreds of miles to the north, the strategic valley of the Ohio River. In what was known as the French and Indian War, Spain allied with France against Britain, and numerous native tribes allied with either side. Britain won the war, France sold Louisiana west of the Mississippi to its ally Spain, and had to cede everything east of the river to Britain. Much of former Louisiana east of the river, home to just a few scattered settlements, became administered as part of Georgia, a British colony centered on the Atlantic port city of Savannah. Spain also lost some land to Britain, their colony of Florida. Not long after, the Revolutionary War saw Britain lose much of its North American possessions to the newly independent United States, and the former French lands along the Mississippi remained a part of Georgia, now a U.S. state. At the same time, Britain returned Florida to Spain, sparking a territorial dispute between Spain and the new United States. During the short period of time in which Britain controlled Florida, they split it in two. Most of the former Spanish colony became part of East Florida, and the colony's western portions, along with former parts of the French colony of Louisiana that sat along the Gulf, became part of West Florida. British settlers had been moving to the colony, and after the independence of the U.S., many Americans began moving into West Florida as well, parts of which were disputed between Spanish and American control. In 1796, Spain and the U.S. temporarily ended the border dispute, and the northern part of West Florida was given to Georgia, while the southern part remained a Spanish colony. The transfer of this new land to Georgia helped spark a major controversy. Most of Georgia's settler population lived near the Atlantic coast around Savannah. Few settlers lived further west, which was mostly inhabited by numerous Native American tribes. This western part of the huge state was often referred to as the Yazoo lands, named for the Yazoo River. George Matthews, Georgia's governor, as well as Senator James Gunn, passed legislation breaking up the land for sale at very cheap prices to their friends and political allies. This corrupt deal became known as the Yazoo land fraud and resulted in major protests across the state. In the next election, the politicians responsible were voted out of office, and reformers began the process of undoing the sales and passing the responsibility of the Yazoo lands onto the federal government. In 1798, they ceded the southwestern part of Georgia that was once part of West Florida to the U.S. government, which gave it a new name after the river that formed its western border, the Mississippi Territory. 4 years later, the rest of the Yazoo lands were given to the federal government and given to the Mississippi Territory 2 years after that. 1 year prior, in 1803, controversy had been rekindled over the rest of West Florida. Many Americans had settled in the coastal Spanish colony, including the former French settlement of Biloxi, and after disagreements with the Spanish government, led a quick revolution, declaring an independent country in the western half of the colony called the Republic of West Florida. Supported by the United States, the country existed for less than 3 months before it was annexed by the U.S. West Florida's successful independence and annexation inspired movements by other American settlers in parts of New Spain such as Tejas, which became independent and later part of the U.S. as Texas. Texas's flag is even based off of the Lone Star flag of West Florida. The new territory was made a part of the country's new massive acquisition to the west, the Louisiana Territory, but in 1812, half of it was given to the Mississippi Territory, giving the territory a coastline. Aside from cities like Natchez, this huge territory was mostly inhabited by native people, such as the Muskogee, Chickasaw, and Choctaw. As American settlers began pushing west and moving into the Mississippi Territory, conflict often broke out between them and the indigenous people who called the land home. Conflict between the Muskogee and American settlers boiled over into a full-fledged war between the U.S. and the Muskogee, known as the Creek War, in 1813. The U.S., under then General Andrew Jackson, won, and thousands of Muskogee were killed and pushed off their land, which the government then opened for settlement. The Muskogee had mostly lived in the eastern half of the Mississippi Territory, and as hundreds of thousands of American settlers poured in, they mostly moved to its eastern half. As the eastern part of the Mississippi Territory saw a huge population boom, people living in the west along the Mississippi River worried that they'd lose power in the territory to those now in the more populous east. They pushed for division of Mississippi into two separate territories, and in March of 1817 were successful. The eastern half of the Mississippi Territory was split off, becoming the new Alabama Territory, and giving Mississippi its current borders. Later that year, on December 10, 1817, Mississippi was admitted to the Union as the 20th state. Its first state capital was Washington, a town just outside of Natchez that had been its territorial capital, but it moved to Natchez soon after. In 1822, the new state decided that it needed a capital city seated in a more central location than Natchez, on the edge of the state. They moved to a location in central Mississippi along the Pearl River, where they founded a new capital city, Jackson, named for Andrew Jackson, then a famous general. For decades, however, it would remain a fairly small town. Early Mississippi was home to around 75,000 people, a population that grew rapidly, doubling nearly every decade until the 1850s, skyrocketing up to nearly 800,000 people in 1860, less than 40 years after statehood. Many American settlers, mostly of Irish and English descent, migrated southwest into Mississippi via the Natchez Trace. On top of the large numbers of migrants moving in, hundreds of thousands of people were forcibly brought to Mississippi in chains. Mississippi was quickly becoming a state almost singularly dependent on agriculture, primarily the cotton industry. And many of the new settlers in the state set up cotton plantations or were connected in other ways to the brutal system of plantation labor. Downstream in Louisiana, New Orleans was a bustling port city near the mouth of the Mississippi River and operated the largest slave market in the country. Millions of people were forcibly taken from their homes in Africa, primarily West Africa, and across the Atlantic on a dangerous journey. Those who survived were sold into slavery throughout the Western Hemisphere, including in the United States. Many people sold into slavery in New Orleans were then shipped in chains upriver to Mississippi cities like Natchez, Greenville, and Vicksburg, forced to work in brutal conditions on cotton plantations along the river, in the Delta, and throughout the state, while plantation owners grew immensely wealthy. These Mississippi cities profited off of the slave trade, and the shipment of cotton downriver from their ports all moved up and down the river by steamboats. There were so many plantations in Natchez that for a time it had the most millionaires per capita in the entire United States, and was a center of the southern plantation elite. In 1850, half of all the millionaires in the entire country lived in Natchez alone. Far from all white Mississippians were wealthy plantation owners, however. Many worked low-paying jobs and lived in poor conditions, though were still a world away from the horrors of slavery. The state, which was born of a fraudulent land deal, had in just a few decades seen huge population growth, becoming a powerful yet deeply unequal society that played a hugely outsized role in the United States, all the while marked by stark racial, social, and economic divisions. Most of northern and central Mississippi at the time were territory belonging to the Chickasaw and Choctaw. To make room for the expansion of the awful institution of slavery, the remaining native people of Mississippi were forced out. Under President Andrew Jackson and his successor Martin Van Buren, 5 tribes, including the Chickasaw and Choctaw, which had retained portions of their homelands in the South by adopting American customs and practices like styles of dress, architecture, government, written language, and even the practice of slavery, were forced west on a brutal forced march known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands of native people, as well as the black people they had enslaved, died on this exodus west to what is now Oklahoma. Today, most Chickasaw and Choctaw live in southeastern Oklahoma, but some Choctaw were allowed to stay. And today, Mississippi has a pretty significant Choctaw population, the only federally recognized tribe in the state. Slavery was dominant in Mississippi to an extent seen in even few other southern states. The fertile lands of the Delta became the core of the country's cotton industry, and were home to one of the highest concentrations of enslaved people in the entire country. By 1860, Mississippi was home to 791,000 people, at 55%, the majority of whom, 436,000, lived in slavery. Only 2 states, Virginia and Georgia, had higher enslaved populations, and both had higher populations overall, giving Mississippi the unfortunate distinction of having one of the highest rates of enslavement in the country. After the election of Abraham Lincoln as president, South Carolina seceded from the Union, and Mississippi was the first state to follow suit. Less than 3 weeks later, on January 9, 1861, 9 other states seceded and formed the Confederacy, a series of events that would lead to the Civil War. Jefferson Davis, a wealthy Mississippi plantation owner who'd represented the state in the House of Representatives and later the Senate, became the Confederacy's president. Most Mississippians who fought in the war sided with the Confederacy, though 17,000, most of whom were black, fought for the Union. Mississippi played a crucial role in the Civil War that ensued. The Mississippi River was an essential conduit for trade and transportation, and control of it was strategically essential. In Mississippi, it was home to most of the state's population and most of its slave plantations. Hardly anyone lived further inland. On top of that, the Confederacy stretched across both sides of the river into Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana. General Ulysses S. Grant pushed Union forces south along the river, taking control with the aim of splitting the Confederacy in half and taking control of the country's most important river. The last section of the river that remained in Confederate control was the Mississippi city of Vicksburg. Grant's forces laid siege to the city for a month and a half in 1863 in one of the most consequential battles of the war, gaining control of the river in a major turning point for the Union. In 1865, the Union won the war and passed the Reconstruction Amendments, ending slavery. Mississippi was the third to last state to rejoin the Union, and was readmitted on February 23, 1870. Mississippi began to see major progress during Reconstruction. The majority black state sent the first 2 black Americans to the U.S. Senate, Hiram Rhodes Revels and Blanche Bruce, the only formerly enslaved American to serve in the Senate. It would be nearly 100 years until another black American was elected to the Senate from any state. Reconstruction would not last forever. Many white Mississippians resented the social and political equality being implemented in the state, and a violent backlash began that, after Union troops were pulled from the South in 1877, turned into a dark era marked by bloodshed, violence, and repression across the state. A series of laws known as the Black Codes significantly reduced the rights of black Mississippians. Militant groups like the KKK prevented black people from voting, committing massacres like in Meridian, where a violent mob forced the city's mayor out of office, assassinated a judge, and murdered several others during a trial. These campaigns of violence allowed the state's white planter elite to regain political power, forcing a majority of the state's population into a second-class citizenship with little rights and say in state government. Cotton remained dominant in Mississippi, with slavery replaced by sharecropping, a system of labor that kept formerly enslaved people working often on the same plantations, at times for no profits whatsoever. It was in many ways slavery by a different name, and was especially prevalent in the cotton-heavy delta. Post-slavery Mississippi remained a land of extreme poverty, racial inequality, and segregation, preserved by sharecropping and racist Jim Crow laws. The century following the end of Reconstruction saw Mississippi become the state with the highest number of lynchings in the entire country. Over the course of the next few decades, Mississippi continued to grow in population, reaching 1 million in 1880 and increasing steadily to 2 million by 1940. As it grew, its population began shifting away from the Mississippi River, where most people lived before the war. Biloxi and the Gulf Coast continued to grow as a beachside vacation destination. The biggest growth came in Meridian, a small town that grew to become the largest city in the state when rail lines connected it to the rail hub of Atlanta and the rest of the country. The city saw significant industrial growth, as cotton and timber grown throughout the state was transported there, processed, and shipped to the rest of the country, and it soon became filled with factories and tall buildings. The railroad eventually made it to Jackson, Mississippi's small and sleepy capital city, which finally started growing as well. By 1920, it overtook Meridian and became the largest city in the state. As the Delta continued to clear out its forests to make way for farmland, it became home to not just black sharecroppers, but numerous immigrant groups as well. Many Irish immigrants moved to the Delta. Mexican immigration to the region saw the creation of the Delta tamale, or hot tamale, a spicy tamale which incorporates both Mexican and Southern elements of cooking, and a Chinese community originating from Guangdong has lived there since the 1800s. The teddy bear was invented in 1903 after President Theodore Roosevelt visited the Delta on a hunting trip and refused to kill a bear. Blues music developed in the Delta, and other genres like jazz, gospel, and rock and roll were heavily influenced by the state. Influential artists like B.B. King and Bo Diddley came from the state. One of the most famous musicians of all time, Elvis Presley, was born in Tupelo. His music was influenced by a number of black artists in the state, and he helped popularize rock and roll along with a number of other genres around the world. To this day, he remains an iconic figure and one of the most successful musicians ever. Mississippi played an essential role in the civil rights movement, as it was home to one of the largest black populations in the country, as well as some of the most horrific attacks on civil and human rights during the Jim Crow era. In the Delta in 1955, a young boy from Chicago named Emmett Till was visiting his family and was kidnapped and brutally murdered after supposedly whistling at a white woman, and his killers walked free. Thousands of volunteers came to the state in 1964 to help with Mississippi Freedom Summer, a voter registration drive in a state where black people had often been prevented from voting for the last century. 3 volunteers, James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman, were murdered in the Mississippi town of Philadelphia by Klan members working with the local police department. During that same year, civil rights leaders built an organization called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which gained significant membership in protest to the state Democratic Party, sending only white delegates to the 1964 presidential convention. A number of influential civil rights leaders came out of Mississippi, such as Ida B. Wells, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Medgar Evers, who was assassinated in Jackson in 1963. Fleeing segregation, discrimination, and poverty, as well as a boll weevil plague that decimated the cotton industry, many black people from across the South began leaving as jobs opened up in northern cities during the World Wars. Known as the Great Migration, Mississippi, which had been majority black for most of its history, saw some of the largest outmigration of any state. A fifth of all black Southerners who moved north during the Great Migration left Mississippi, and its black population plummeted, trends that continued after the World Wars, as many black Mississippians left the struggling state to seek out opportunity elsewhere. In 1900, Mississippi's population was 58% black. In 1980, that number was down to 35%, one of the largest decreases in both sheer numbers and percent of black residents of any state. Most migrants left the state for areas directly north, somewhat to Memphis, but most left the South altogether, going to cities like Indianapolis, St. Louis, Kansas City, and Milwaukee. Chicago, in particular, saw large numbers of Mississippians flock to the city, helping build the large black population it has today. Despite the Great Migration, Mississippi saw slow population growth, nearing 3 million. The legalization of gambling in 1990 was huge for the state. Today, the Gulf Coast has the 5th highest gambling revenue of any metro area in the U.S. after Las Vegas, Atlantic City, Chicago, and D.C. Casinos sprung up everywhere. The cities along the Mississippi River and the Gulf Coast in particular became major gambling towns, continuing to cement its role as a popular but affordable vacation destination. For a time, Mississippi was the second most profitable gambling state in the country, after just Nevada, but that has since been in decline, in part due to Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Though mostly known for its devastation in New Orleans, Katrina killed 236 Mississippians, wiping out entire towns and wreaking havoc in the state's Gulf Coast. Over the last 2 decades, the state's population has been stagnating and begun to decline, trends that are expected to continue. The state has struggled to grow and diversify its economy, and many people remain trapped in poverty or don't see opportunities there in the future. These issues have made other issues harder to deal with, and today, a number of statistics sadly point to the many challenges that modern Mississippi faces. Out of the 50 states, it's ranked last on the Human Development Index, last in median family income and per capita income, 49th in quality of life. It has the highest poverty rate in the entire country, and ranks 4th in income inequality. It's the 3rd most dependent on federal aid, has the 2nd lowest life expectancy, the 3rd worst infrastructure quality, the highest obesity rate, the 3rd highest murder rate, lowest GDP per capita, the lowest quality of healthcare, 2nd highest population decline of any state in the country. The recent water crisis in Jackson exemplifies the scale of disinvestment and poverty the state faces, even in its center of government and population. Floods in 2022 caused the failure of the city's water treatment plant and left most of the city without safe drinking water, a problem which has still not been fully solved. These are all huge problems that Mississippi must deal with going forward. On the bright side, there are a few areas where Mississippi is doing well. You'd expect a state with the highest poverty rate in the country to have one of the highest crime rates as well, but overall, it's about on par with the rest of the country. On top of that, as many parts of the country struggle with rising homelessness, Mississippi has the lowest homelessness rate in the U.S., as well as the highest black home ownership rate. Granted, these statistics don't speak to the quality of the homes themselves, and many Mississippi houses are in very poor conditions, but it's still generally a positive trend the state can look to. The state's largest city is Jackson, home to just 347,000 people in its urban area. It's a fairly small city. Mississippi's seat of government, it's home to the state capitol, a pretty nice looking capitol building with a classic dome on top. Downtown Jackson has a number of tall buildings and high-rises, like the beautiful Art Deco Standard Life building, but generally nothing super tall. Most of the state's tallest buildings are casinos in other parts of the state. Not far outside downtown, you'll see signs of Mississippi's economic challenges, with vacant lots, crumbling roads, and buildings falling into disrepair. Many wealthier, often white Jacksonians have left the city for the more well-off suburbs in a trend known as white flight, giving the city high de facto segregation. There's a lot of great things about Jackson, though. It has great food and music and is home to a number of nice museums, most notably the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, the country's first state-sponsored civil rights museum. Overall, few cities in the country have gone through as much as Jackson has and still push on, and hopefully things will start to improve for the city and state because it's got a lot to offer. I'm going to turn it over to McConnell, a fan of the channel from Mississippi, to talk for a little bit about what he loves about his home state.
Fellow, I am McConnell, and I'm here to tell you about the great state of Mississippi. Down here, everyone's nice. It's like one of our nicknames is the hospitality state, and we'll feed you well too. We love our food. I mean, you got our typical biscuits, grits, you got fried chicken. And where I live here on the coast, you also got a bunch of Cajun influence like gumbo and stuff. So it is, food-wise, the best place to live. The college football scene is like none other. You've got a ton of Alabama fans, a ton of LSU fans, but the main people who rule are Ole Miss and Mississippi State. I cannot express to you enough how important this rivalry is. And I saw something one time, and it basically summed it up perfectly. If you go undefeated the whole season and you lose to your rival, that is a losing season. So that is what we're talking about in terms of college football. Professional sports-wise, most people in the state root for the New Orleans Saints in football, or they might root for the Atlanta Braves in baseball, although I personally root for the Houston Astros. Overall, I love this state. I mean, look at the scenery. Like, you can't tell me that isn't pretty. The sun just set about 3 minutes ago. And look at that. That's my summary on the state of Mississippi. Thank you for watching this video. I love this place.
56% of Mississippians are white and 37% are black, the largest proportion of black residents of any state in the entire country, and surpassed in the U.S. overall only by the Virgin Islands and the District of Columbia. 3% of Mississippians are Latino. It's one of the most religious states in the country, tied for first with neighboring Alabama, with 82% of Mississippians considering themselves religious, and it has the second highest weekly church attendance after just Utah. Most Mississippians are Christian, and the vast majority of them Protestant, at 77% of the entire population. It's the second highest proportion of Protestants in the U.S. after Alabama, and it generally has some of the lowest rates of other sects of Christianity or other religions in general of any state. Most Protestants in the state are evangelicals, with the largest denomination being the Southern Baptists. Mississippi has great food. Lots of great soul food, barbecue, and Southern food can be found in the state. On top of that, not far from Louisiana, it's home to delicious Cajun and Creole cuisine, po' boys, and other Louisiana staples. The state is famous for catfish. It's by far the largest producer of catfish in the entire country, and you can find some delicious catfish throughout the Magnolia State. Comeback sauce, a delicious southern dipping sauce, came out of Jackson, and of course you can't talk about Mississippi foods without mentioning the Mississippi mud pie. It's a famous, gooey, chocolatey dessert that was invented in Vicksburg, and got its name as it looked like the muddy banks of the Mississippi River. Many Mississippians speak with southern accents, and they can differ widely depending on where you are in the state. People on the Gulf Coast will sound different than people in central or northern Mississippi. The largest newspaper in the state is the Clarion Ledger in Jackson. Some well-known colleges include the University of Mississippi, or Ole Miss, in Oxford, and Mississippi State in Starkville. Mississippi has no professional sports teams, but like in much of the South, college sports are huge. Ole Miss and Mississippi State are hugely popular, especially their football teams. As for pro sports, Mississippians tend to root for New Orleans, Atlanta, Memphis, or Miami-based teams. Its busiest airports are the Jackson Medgar Wiley Evers International Airport in Jackson and the Gulfport Biloxi International Airport in Gulfport. The state's largest company is Sanderson Farms, a poultry company based in Laurel. Many famous people are from or lived in Mississippi. The most famous is, of course, Elvis Presley, but there's also Oprah Winfrey, Britney Spears, James Earl Jones, Rick Ross, Brett Favre, Jim Henson, Sam Cooke, Tammy Wynette, William Faulkner, Tennessee Williams, Diplo, Conway Twitty, Fred Armisen, Jimmy Buffett, Ray J, R.J. Mitty, Muddy Waters, Slim Jimmy, and Sway Lee. No presidents were from Mississippi, but Zachary Taylor owned a plantation in the state. Politically, Mississippi is very conservative and is a reliably red state, usually voting for the Republican Party by fairly solid margins. The last Democrat to win a presidential election there was Jimmy Carter in 1976. It has a Cook Partisan Voting Index, or PVI, of R+11, which means that in a given presidential year, Republicans tend to do about 11% better in Mississippi than they do on average nationally. Out of its 4 representatives in the House of Representatives, 3 are Republicans and 1 is a Democrat. Both its senators, Roger Wicker and Cindy Hyde-Smith, are Republicans, as is its governor, Tate Reeves. That is it for Mississippi. I want to give a big thank you to everyone who has already joined my Patreon. Through it, you can access different things such as behind-the-scenes videos, early access to maps I create, an exclusive Discord Q&A with me, and shoutouts in my videos such as these. Please be sure to check out the TII store, where you'll be able to purchase all sorts of official That Is Interesting products and merchandise, including shirts, hoodies, embroidered beanies, masks, mugs, embroidered backpacks, laptop stickers and sleeves, and so on. Also, please subscribe to my brother's channel, Quinn the Cameraman. He made the great intro at the beginning of this video that I'll use in all my US Explained videos, so go show him some support. I tried to be pretty thorough with this video, but I know there were definitely things I missed as there was a lot to talk about. I want to give a big thank you to everyone from Mississippi who helped give me information for this video, leaving detailed and informative comments on YouTube as well as Discord. I truly would not have been able to make this video without all your help. My next video in this series will be on Illinois. I'm really excited. It's a state where I've spent a lot of time, so I'm looking forward to making a great video on it for you guys. If you're from Illinois, please respond to my community post or my comment here, or leave something in the Discord server to let me know what you'd like to see included about your home state. I really appreciate the well over 800 of you who have already joined my Discord server. If you haven't joined the Discord server yet, it's a great place to continue conversations about the topics discussed in these videos, interact with fellow viewers, and help provide information about upcoming states in this series. It's a great community, and we do fun stuff like geography game nights, live podcasts, and so on. I'll put links to both the Patreon and the Discord in the description. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you learned something new. Subscribe for more content like this. I cover the countries, cities, people, and places of the world and beyond. These videos will leave you saying, that is interesting.